Good evening. I'm Andy Agafangelo. I'm proud to be the founder of campaign group Transparency Task Force. We are a certified social enterprise with a formal mission, which is to promote reform of the financial sector so it serves society better. Our belief is that the financial industry is profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability, and to political stability too. But we also believe the industry has a predisposition to misbehave, and when it can, it does. We are of the view that there's a general lack of accountability in the financial sector, and also that when it does misbehave, it can misbehave in a horrendous way. Of course, we can think of the global financial crisis as perhaps the greatest example of the horrific consequences of what happens when the financial industry gets carried away with itself. Let's put it that way. That global financial crisis caused over 10,000 people to take their own lives, according to research by Oxford University, as well as many years of austerity and all kinds of economic and financial challenges for the world. Over the last 10 years of running the Transparency Task Force, we have become increasingly concerned about the checks and balances in the system not working as they should. We've also become increasingly concerned about the disconnect between different things. For example, we understand that something like 40% of all reported crime relates to fraud of one kind or another, yet only 2% or less of police resourcing is allocated to fighting fraud. Many of our members are victims of fraud and financial crime themselves. Many of our members are people who have had sometimes entire life savings stolen away from them through fraudulent activity of one kind or another. And not always, but very often, there's a degree of regulatory failure involved in the system as well. So the topic of fraud, financial crime, these sorts of things are of enormous interest to our community, a community that's mostly UK based, but we have roughly 20% or so of our members around the world in 20 countries. It's therefore great for us to have a chance to listen to Jeremy Asher talk to us about his book, Fraud Markers, Debanking and Financial Crime. Jeremy has been very kind to set aside some time to have the conversation with us this evening. He's going to be talking about himself, his background, the book, his motivation for writing the book, what the key learnings are, and hopefully what will be of real interest to us is what his views are about what could and should be done to tackle this horrific problem of fraud in the UK. Just to give you a little bit of background, previously Jeremy built and led the fraud and business crime team at a top 100 UK law firm. He's very highly ranked in that regard. He's defended businesses, directors, and professionals in cases brought by the Serious Fraud Office, HMRC, the Crown Prosecution Service, and other regulators. And he's secured over 500 successful criminal prosecutions for government bodies and private clients. Many of his cases have received national media coverage. In fact, we were just chatting about the debanking of Nigel Farage before the event started. That's a good example of the kind of coverage that Jeremy's work has led to. In addition to financial crime work, Jeremy has extensive experience in alcohol and entertainment licensing law, acting for both local authorities and private clients in contentious and non-contentious matters. But his real niche these days is this tricky topic of fraud, financial crime, demarking, and related areas. Before we pass over to Jeremy to tell us a bit more about himself, his background, the book, the key learnings from the book, the aspirations for the future, can I please invite everybody to join me in thanking Jeremy for setting aside some time for tonight's conversation in the normal way. So, Jeremy, thank you very much for being here. I've already enjoyed the conversation we had just before the meeting started. Jeremy, over to you to take it from here. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Just to point out, I didn't actually act for Nigel Farage, but we'll probably have a conversation about what he went through later. I want to begin tonight by talking about the relevance of my book to the work that the Transparency Task Force does. My book is called Fraud Markers, Debanking and Financial Crime, a legal analysis of counterfraud practices in the UK and beyond. It's published by Routledge, which is the banner for Taylor and Francis. After I've spoken about the relevance of my book to the work that TTF does, I'll explain how I came to write the book and how it fits into my narrative about my passion for educating people about the risks of the pernicious and evil practice of money muling. I hope by the time you've heard what I have to say that you will be encouraged to read my book. The Transparency Task Force is built on 5 core beliefs. I will take each in turn and explain how they correlate to my book. Andy, can you hear me okay?
Perfectly well. Yes, indeed.
Great. Okay. So the first core belief is this. The financial services sector is profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability and political stability too. So the 2023 joint study by Crowe, the University of Portsmouth and Peter and Peters found that fraud costs the UK economy up to £219 billion annually. The Office of National Statistics reported that for the year ending September 2024, there was a 19% rise in fraud incidents in England and Wales. That's 3.9 million of them. It also found that consumer and retail fraud rose by 26%. Bank account credit fraud rose by 15%, and the police recorded that fraud rose by 9.2% to 1.2 million incidents. The financial services sector is by default at the front line in the fight against fraud. It is therefore charged by the state with protecting the economy from fraud. It is for that reason that the fraud databases were established, alongside the laws that enable them to operate and share data. My book provides historical perspective behind the various pressures and legislation that enabled the databases to be created. It explains how databases operate alongside counter-fraud procedures to protect the nation from fraud and money laundering. The second core belief is this. The financial services sector has a moral, ethical, and professional duty to behave transparently. So the financial service sector has the power to debank, and in so doing has the power to halt careers, businesses, livelihoods, and prevent access to credit. Therefore, it follows that it has a moral, ethical, and professional duty to behave transparently in relation to debanking. My book explains how and why debanking is used by the financial service sector. The issue is enormous. I estimate that there are more than 2 million CIFAS markers currently in existence in their various forms. See pages 7 to 8 of my book for my reasoning on that. I wrote the book because there has been very little recent academic research into fraud markers and the operation of fraud databases. The book enhances, updates, and explains earlier academic work undertaken in 2012 by Professor Nicholas Riders, published Money Laundering: An Endless Cycle, a comparative analysis of the anti-money laundering policies in the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada, and also by Professor Mark Button's published work, The Fraud Justice Systems, a scoping study on the civil, regulatory, and private paths to justice for fraudsters, main report, November 2016. The book also fills in numerous gaps in understanding missed by publications such as Tom Burgess's Kleptopia, How Dirty Money is Conquering the World, and Oliver Bullow's Butler to the World, How Britain Became the Servants of Tycoons, Tax Dodgers, Kleptocrats and Criminals, both of which are excellent books. My book also adds legal practitioner perspective to Nick Wallace's The Great Post Office Scandal. My book includes practical detail and examples of the use of fraud databases, providing commentary on some of the topics discussed by those authors. My book also refers to case studies, including examples of the cruelty of the systems and the subsequent devastation to lives that debanking can cause. This book will help the reader to join the dots explored by those writers and academics, providing the reader with a greater understanding of fraud prevention systems and the societal issues that surround them. The third core belief is this: there is a strong correlation between transparency, truthfulness, and trustworthiness. In my experience, some banks and regulators have not been trustworthy, truthful, and transparent. I discuss some examples of this in my book. I do name and shame. I have a naughty step of organizations that are less willing to engage positively and admit to mistakes than others. Some organizations do not like being challenged and called out. Others don't understand the law or their legal duties. There is also a reluctance to acknowledge that genuine victims of fraud are being debanked. This is increasingly so with the rise of AI and deepfake. The book also explains the correlation between private prosecutions and the operation of the fraud databases, drawing uncomfortable comparisons between the inappropriate use of fraud databases and the post office scandal. As a former prosecutor, having successfully led more than 500 private prosecutions, I'm well placed to comment on this. Financial organizations are having to be careful not to mark those who have been exploited, but in my experience, they could do much better at this. The fourth core belief of TTF is this: that the vast majority of people working in the sector want it to change for the better. After I published the book, I received the following message from an employee at a bank. I'm so pleased you're smashing out inaccurate CIFAS market cases. It causes so much harm and all banks get it wrong sometimes, including my own, as you'll know. Nothing is perfect, but intentions are genuinely good. The final core belief is that small groups of right-minded and collaboratively minded people who are united by a common cause can drive positive change. I hope that by writing the book, positive change would happen. Recent events have cast doubt in my mind about that, particularly because the government appears to have bowed to pressure to create the recognized legitimate interest in relation to loading to databases where financial crimes are suspected. This makes it more difficult to argue that markers should be removed. The arguments are more technical now. They're not impossible. However, the tenet remains the same. There is a reverse burden of proof. People who have been marked to fraud databases have to prove that they are innocent. And it also helps if you can prove your organization got it wrong when loading the marker. But how do you do that when you don't even understand what you've done wrong, nor understand how the systems operate? Fraud markers can be Kafkaesque. The book is also an important commentary on our human rights. So let's talk about the background behind the book. Lockdown changed my career path forever. My private prosecution practice died overnight. I had litigation funders pull out when they realized they would not see a return on their investments due to the enormous delays that built into an already beleaguered criminal justice system. I was quickly placed on furlough by my employers. Luckily, I had a plan B. I'd been doing some formative work on fraud markers for a couple of years. I'd run a few cases. I'd spotted that no lawyers had ever written about fraud markers and none openly specialized in it. I wrote an article for my then firm's website, and as soon as it went live, the phone started ringing. I was taken off furlough to deal with the interest I was generating. I was inundated with inquiries, and I quickly realized that the subject was far more complex than I had first thought. In my practice, we continue to receive hundreds of inquiries a month from people who have been debanked. I used to speak to all of them. In that way, I was able to start decoding reports I was seeing, using that intelligence gathering to understand how the moving parts of the fraud markers worked. I was able to use my experience as a criminal lawyer and especially as a prosecutor to unpick the bank's procedures. I also had previous experience of working with banking regulation. I was able to uncover inconsistencies of approach between the organizations that load markers. I started to see themes emerge. Bounce back loan frauds quickly came to light, with company directors complaining they had been debanked. But overwhelmingly, the most common inquiry was from students who had been debanked. It transpired that they had been accused of being money mules, the foot soldiers of the fraud world, who are a vital cog in the wheel of money laundering. Without money mules, organized criminals cannot cash out their ill-gotten gains. The young money mules I was speaking to were the equivalent of cannon fodder. They were blindly ignorant. Barely any had ever read their bank's terms and conditions. Hardly any understood what money laundering was, nor that it was a criminal offence. It was obvious that their ignorance left them wide open to exploitation. It was upsetting. It also made me angry. I told my wife, Maria, about this issue. Maria used to work in education. Together, we produced some training. She helped me with the style of delivery, and we refined it. I then went into 2 schools, one in Liverpool and the other to my daughter's old school. The results were staggering. The engagement in the subject was amazing. Young adults wanted to learn about this stuff. They wanted to be able to protect themselves. When Maria came up with the idea of educating children about the risk of money muling, nobody was writing about it, let alone doing anything to educate about the risks. Some formative work had been done during lockdown. Lloyds apparently spent £250,000 on a focus group that came up with no more than we had come up with at the kitchen table one weekend. I started to blog about the issues I was uncovering, and I wrote articles. I soon realized writing is an incredibly powerful tool, especially if you can direct it into the right places. LinkedIn is an amazing format for thought generation. The fraud community, or rather the counter-fraud community, is small and nepotistic. It is also very inward-focused and self-congratulatory, ridiculously so when you think that fraud is rising at an exponential rate. Since I started writing about fraud, it has increased from 41% to 45% of all reported crime in the UK. The figures are truly shocking and continue to go the wrong way. But a group of committed academics and counter-fraud professionals, led by Robert Brooker, who was then chairman of the London Fraud Forum, rallied around my writing about my experience of delivering money mule awareness training to young people. Together, we gathered interested people from our networks on LinkedIn, and gradually a nucleus of about 30 people formed a loose group. We called it the School Project, the forerunner of the Financial Fraud Awareness Campaign, which I now chair. We were concerned that there was nothing being done to warn children in particular about the risks of money muling. I was becoming exasperated. The number of people who told me I had no idea, and if only I'd known, beggared belief. Sadly, as the rising fraud figures show, there still isn't enough fraud awareness education. Online training is not effective. It is ignored. People don't read warnings, and online messaging is weak and inconsistent. I've even had bank staff come to me who admitted they didn't concentrate or understand the tick box AML compliance questionnaires they were sent, or didn't really listen to the films they were shown. Result, they were debanked and sacked. People don't read terms and conditions. They also consistently don't read banks' online onboarding messages and warning messages. TV is a powerful format, but the work that is being done is generic and clearly isn't strong enough. I've struggled to get the papers to write about the issue. Even though I made hay when Nigel Farage was debanked, it seems that the media doesn't see that it has an important role to play when it comes to the really crucial issue of money muling. The best way to educate people is old-fashioned face-to-face training where experts can discuss perceptions and explain in detail about dangers. It works. That way you can deliver consistent police-approved messaging. You can signpost. You can read the room and uncover trends. You can test whether attitudes have been changed. You can then refine. The Financial Fraud Awareness Campaign can draw on more than 2,000 members of the various regional fraud forums to help to deliver this vital training in person. The book is therefore part academic explanation, part call to arms. Maria and my friend Richard Swarbrick encouraged me to write a book about debanking. Richard had got me the speaking gig at my daughter's old school, and he is my co-director in the community interest company that now operates the Financial Fraud Awareness Campaign. I started writing with gusto one Christmas, aided by the fact that our new puppy was not settling in and got me out of bed at 3 a.m. every morning. I used that quiet time wisely. I quickly gathered a lot of information together and read books, academic papers, and articles. But then I ran into the problem of what to do with the information I gathered, and more importantly, how to focus it. I was also struggling to find a publisher. It was after I met up with Dr. Sam Mapston, who's senior lecturer in law at the University of West of England, at a fraud forum event, that the book started to take shape. She suggested I write an academic book. She put the idea to Professor Nick Ryder at Cardiff University. They are both coincidentally members of the advisory board of the Financial Fraud Awareness Campaign, and Nick accepted the idea into his academic series, The Law of Economic Crime. Together with Dr. Lashmi Singh, my academic editor, who was also at University of West of England, we came up with the idea of 5 chapters. They are an introduction to the databases, what they are and how they operate. The second chapter is about the money muling problem, what it is, and the extent of the issue, and how the debanking and the fraud database operate. The third is about fraud. Again, that chapter also refers to my experience of how the fraud databases are used with examples and commentary. The fourth chapter is about the international reach of fraud databases. I've tried to identify other countries that use fraud databases and to understand how they operate. And then the last chapter is about justice and transparency. I take a deeper dive into 3 core questions that run as themes throughout the preceding chapters. Those themes are these. Firstly, is it right for private organizations to have unfettered state powers over civilians, which sometimes exceed Article 8 of the European Court of Human Rights principles? The second question is, would greater transparency mean that many financial offences will be prevented from happening in the first place? And the final question is it right for the standard of proof for loading markers to be below that of criminal standard? We were then able to sell the idea to the publishers Taylor and Francis, which publishes under the title Routledge. The proviso was that my book had to be short format. Therefore, my book is thankfully thin, even though it took me 20 months to finalize it. But that short format created a challenge. I could have written a book 3 times longer than one that you see before you. So, what is the book's relevance to transparency? My book will help people to understand why these fraud databases operate. But when they read it, they will also question whether fraud databases are a price for our freedom, or do they undermine our freedom? They are important issues that few people outside academic and government circles seem to have put much thought into. The book is to a large extent original thinking on the issues at hand. That's why the style of the book is accessible. I've tried to keep the language simple and clear, and have tried to explain the issues discussed in layman's terms so everyone can understand them. In contrast, I've never understood why the organizations that load fraud markers have not explained in clearer terms to their customers about the fraud marker systems they use. Most of the people I've spoken to have been affected by fraud markers who complained that they had no idea what CIFAS is, and that includes many people working in banking and finance. I wrote, surely if people are forewarned of the risks, they can make better informed decisions. And by being explicit about the consequences, would it not potentially save the banks vast sums of money on fraud prevention? The Financial Conduct Authority published a report on the 23rd of January 2025, which demonstrated a wide variance in the use of the National Fraud Database in relation to the reporting of money mule activity. 25 firms were monitored who reported anywhere between 6% and 66% of cases to the NFD between January 2022 and September 2023. Of 194,084 accounts that were off-boarded, only 37% were reported to the National Fraud Database. Part of the reason for that must be that banks have recognized that most money mules are non-complicit or unwitting. Doesn't unwitting mean ignorant? I am proud of the positive impact that the Financial Fraud Awareness Campaign has had on shaping government policy and bringing fraud awareness education out into the open. More organisations, particularly banks, are promoting fraud awareness within their brands. The Southwest Regional Organised Crime Unit has put together a package for schools that fits within their lesson plans under the national curriculum. However, much more needs to be done, and I hope my book will help to promote that work. I think everyone with a bank account needs to read my book, not just academics. The police don't understand how these systems operate. When people have been scammed, they tell them to delete their data, unwittingly wrecking any chances of the victim being able to prove their innocence should they be debanked. The book will help to educate. The groups that are involved in money muling are wide. Aside from schools and universities, some significant areas of concern that I see on a weekly basis in my practice are the following groups. It's a long list. Young adults who have left education and who are entrusted with bank accounts for the first time are prey to organised crime networks who target their naivety and willingness to earn money through side hustles. Economic migrants are prone to assisting each other, commonly falling into the trap of acting as money mules, where language barriers and ignorance is preyed upon. Businesses are targeted to move money for fraudsters through active participation or by covert means. Startup enterprises with little understanding of account security and good practices are targeted. People selling products online using forums such as Facebook Marketplace, where chargebacks are commonly used by fraudsters not just to obtain goods illegally, but to launder the proceeds of crime. Victims of domestic abuse and those facing coercion within their relationships. Cryptocurrency users are commonly targeted and used to launder the proceeds of crime. And chargebacks are frequently used by fraudsters against innocent people trying to cash out their legitimately purchased and invested crypto assets. Older people are targets of approved push payment frauds and theft of account details. People looking for work are targeted by bogus job adverts, which are fronts used by OCNs to develop mule accounts. Those poorer members of society who are offered money in return for their account details. Violence is increasingly used to extort bank details. Gamblers using black market unregulated betting operators enabling money laundering and terrorist financing at an alarming rate. Cultures where there are laudable traditions of money lending and assisting family members are vulnerable to OCNs. And finally, diaspora and cultures where unregulated money transfers, such as hawala, are commonly used, for example, in Nigeria and Pakistan. All of these groups are prey to financial exploitation. All need to be educated about the risks they face. I hope my book helps to do that. If the book acts as a catalyst for debate and change, making the counter-fraud systems operated by the financial service firms more transparent, then I'll be delighted. I also hope my book may deter people from becoming bad actors. It may also help prevent some of them from being exploited. It may even inspire some to make careers in counter-fraud. I leave my final comments to Terry Pratchett, who wrote, "They say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, but it's not one half so bad as a lot of ignorance." If you haven't done so already, please read my book. I think it's rather important, and I'm glad and grateful that the Transparency Task Force agrees. Thank you.
And Jeremy, thank you very much indeed. What a clear and compelling set of reasons, not only to read the book, but also to you've set out so nicely about the alignment between the overall purpose of Transparency Task Force, trying to get the financial sector to be more transparent, more truthful, and more trustworthy, and your own work, Jeremy. We are very, very closely aligned. I've got so many questions and comments for you, Jeremy. I could hog you all night, but I won't. I'll just put a few in, and then we'll
Okay.
then we'll open up. You spoke about deterrent earlier. Allow me to explain why I've picked up on that particular point. If the only facts we knew were that roughly 40+% of all reported crime is fraud, and less than, let's say, 2% of police resources goes towards investigating it, if the only two facts we knew were those two facts, it is effectively an advert to all the criminally minded that says, apply here, become a fraudster, become a financial criminal. You'll almost definitely not even get investigated.
Yeah.
Chances of you being prosecuted and banged up in jail are virtually non-existent. You'll make an absolute fortune while you're doing it. All you've got to be is dodgy enough to not lose sleep over this sort of stuff, but go and make yourself rich. No need to stick a balaclava over your head and walk into a post office or a bank with a shotgun. Just rip people's money off them through financial crime of one kind or another. Are we are we making a massive mistake, Jeremy, in investigating and prosecuting fraud so badly that the whole thing is basically getting out of control, and too many people are motivated to get stuck into this nefarious activity?
Okay, so the bottom line is this: the the situation we are faced with in the UK, which is a national emergency with fraud, is of our own making.
Right,
Okay,
agreed.
it started with faster banking. Okay, because that speed has enabled criminals to just outwit everybody in law enforcement. Once the fraud databases do have a vital function in protecting the nation from fraud, because they spot the banks spot the activity, and when they see an account that they have reasonable suspicion of, enabling criminal activity, they will block it. They will then report it to the National Crime Agency, and then they will debank. And the idea is to get those criminal accounts out of the system and the people who operate them out of the system. Okay. But it isn't on its own working, is it? Because the figures are just going that way and continuing to do so. It will only ever work if you put a very concerted effort into aligning fraud awareness education with policing and counter fraud activities. Yeah, the government has absolutely got to step up and properly fund the criminal justice system that over my 25 years in practice has just crumbled. It's heartbreaking to see it. I mean, when you've got 70,000 people in the court list,
70,000.
and you've got 70,000 people in prison, and there you are, you're debanking 200,000 people for money muling. It just suddenly, it's absolutely mind-blowingly awful. And where we are really at risk is that people haven't got a clue. And because they are ignorant, they fall into the trap of enabling criminals and criminal networks, and by allowing their bank accounts to be used. And the criminals are very clever and it's very subtle. You can't get these messages across in a sort of blanket, approach,
Mhm.
particularly when you're dealing with laudable and honorable cultures that help people and share things and, will always there to help each other. They're just being exploited. So the bottom line is education and proper fraud awareness education has got to be part of that triangle of law enforcement, of counter fraud, and then awareness, so people actually understand the risks, so they don't fall into it. That's your problem.
Thank you, Jeremy. The perception we have in very general terms here is that people who are victims of fraud and financial crime, white collar crime generally, are just not treated in the same way as victims of crime, the way that somebody would if, let's say, they had I don't know, the
Yeah.
computer stolen off them or the house was burgled, if they got hit over the head by a mugger or something horrible like that. I'm going to share my screen, Jeremy, to share some thoughts with yourself and others around this theme of the harsh reality that people who've become victims of financial crime really are victims.
Oh yeah, yeah,
You, you, you
absolutely.
can you can see my screen. A couple of years ago, we produced this document, Faces of Financial Crime. It was about the suffering caused by the financial sector,
Mm.
and it's basically a piece of academic work we did with some young academics. We're very proud of it, and what we wanted to try to do is help everybody understand the emotional and financial shock and
Yeah.
trauma of becoming a victim of a scam or something like it.
Mhm.
And we called, as you saw, we called this document Faces of Financial Crime. And every one of these pictures, it's full of lots of pictures. Every one of these pictures tells a story in terms of what's going on here. For example, when I see this story here of the presumably the wife cross and angry talking to the husband, my imagination tells me he's invested a load of the family's money into some investment. He's just realized it's all been a bogus Ponzi scheme. He's really upset and feeling bad and guilty. He's distraught. She's understandably really angry, bottom left here, we've got the old guy in the hospital bed. Looks like he just had a heart attack or something horrible. We know so many people, Jeremy, whose physical health, as well as their mental health, has been completely shocked and shaken by the trauma of financial crime. I put a note in the chat earlier about Ian Davis, rest in peace. Ian took his own life, having lost his entire life savings just as he was about to retire. And this document is built around 22 case studies, as you can see, bank scandals, fake
Mm.
insolvencies, fraudulent investment schemes, et cetera, et cetera. And in the imagery, we try to use imagery to portray ideas, of course. In the imagery, we've got all kinds of images of things, and sometimes the images are directly about the archetypal dodgy criminal type person. But sometimes I'll go to the back of it to show you a couple of very, very specific pictures here. Sometimes the criminals are, dodgy folks. Like you see the guy with the balaclava over his head. It's obviously that's an archetypal, criminal as you'd imagine it. But look at this guy here, the guy with the suit and the tie on. To my mind, Jeremy, and everybody tonight, that is a man representing some kind of professional. He's a banker or he's an accountant or an insolvency practitioner or similar. These people here around the boardroom are representing, in my mind, senior bankers cooking up all kinds of bogus schemes to find ways to illegitimately rob people of their money. We've got people here tonight, Jeremy, on the call who
Mm.
have quite literally had homes unlawfully repossessed through all kinds of fraudulent activity by household name banking organizations. My point is very simply that financial crime, white collar crime, scams really do create real victims.
Mm.
but the support and the empathy for those victims is really nowhere to be seen. It's
I agree.
shocking. It's absolutely shocking. Have you, in your work, Jeremy, have you come across cases that have made you want to, I don't mind admitting it, in my case, what made me want to burst into tears when I've learned about the shenanigans that have gone on and how people have been ripped off. It's horrific.
I get them every week.
It's,
I got angry when I wrote this book. I mean, it when I was writing it scared me. When you actually read about and work out just how much power the state and the banks and the regulators have over you, the average Joe, it is unbelievable. Um, you know, um, and let's be frank about it. I mean, I've named and shamed and I've called it out. I mean, there's a lot of banks out there that have, enabled all this, um, you know, and have acted in a very, let's say, dodgy way. Um, so that's all in there. What I see, uh, 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 the book talks about victimization. I
yeah,
think
yeah,
there's generally now the terminology around that is that one of exploitation rather than victimization, because at the end of the day, people are being exploited. So people who are falling prey to app frauds are being exploited. They're being used to move money through accounts and out into the criminal sphere. Okay.
yeah.
Yes, they're victims, but they have been exploited. Um, the kids who are at the school gate being threatened with a knife to hand over their bank details, they're being exploited. Yeah. So there's a subtlety there. Um, all of it's wrong, but so much of this can be cut out if people understand the risks. Okay, understand how everything works so that they are then better armed. And they, what we're proposing at FFAC is specified work, to go out into different groups, different communities, to teach them about the specific risks that they're facing. And we've got a program this term actually at University of West of England that I'm working with the university on it, with the law department there, to develop those ideas and that training, so we can really focus in on specific groups, um, and in a very nice, polite, gentle way ease them into, well, look, this is where your risk is, this is where your weakness in how you're operating is, this is what you need to do to protect yourself from it. And I think if you can protect people from being exploited, and the only way to do that is through education, then you're going to protect people, you're going to hopefully reduce the number of victims. Now, the big picture here is this: the money mules are feeding money into the criminal networks who need them to cash out their ill-gotten gains. There's a direct correlation between the amount of fraud going on and the amount of muling going on. If you cut out the money mules, if you reduce the foot soldiers, it leaves the criminals nowhere to go other than going offshore or into crypto, and they can be traced and those assets can be seized. So the whole plan isn't just about being nicey. There is actually some real methodology and logical thinking behind it to try to reduce the incidence of fraud to the UK. So that's what it's all about to me. And yeah, I've seen some horrendous cases, and I've given case examples in the book, but I see them all the time where you think, oh my God, I actually get angry. Um,
I'm sorry to cut in there. I'm actually pleased that you get angry because that's how I feel. That's how many people in
mm,
this Transparency Task Force community feel. I mean, so much so that we literally sometimes take to the streets and march and protest. We've marched in
yeah,
London a
yeah,
few times.
yeah.
We've marched in Dublin before, and a lot of our energy is being directed at the checks and balances in the system that just don't seem to be working as they should. I think Brian
Yeah.
Riley made a comment in the chat about the central bank, that's the regulator in Ireland. In the UK, we've got all kinds of issues and concerns about, in our view, the lack of effectiveness of the Financial Conduct Authority. Um, there are all kinds of things that happen, Jeremy, which you'll be aware of, where the fraudsters know exactly where the regulatory perimeter is, and they kind of they weave this spell around that regulatory perimeter, so the individual, the investor, thinks they've got regulatory protections, but they actually haven't. And
Mm,
sometimes it's even worse than that. In the case of mini bonds, many people feel that they were regulated investments. But then after the event, after people lost their money, the regulators took the view that no, they were never ever regulated. There's all
mm.
kinds of shenanigans going on to try to duck and dive responsibility. Is this an international issue from your point of view, Jeremy? Is the UK any better, any worse than other countries here?
Well, the UK leads the field in fraud by a country mile at the moment. I suspect that the USA will soon overtake it
Right.
as a percentage, partly because its president has decided to do away with a lot of the counter fraud measures and reporting authorities. I think Mayara, who's I see at the top, I noticed was on the list, would be able to
Yeah.
tell us more about that. I'd be fascinated to hear her views on it. But the US has got fraud databases, they've got checks systems, and they've got First Defense, which operate in a similar way to the databases here, CIFAS, National Hunter, and Synetic Solutions. Um, and it was quite difficult for me to unlock a lot of the information in the States because it's all hidden behind paywalls and firewalls, and very difficult for me on a laptop in the UK to access quite a lot of the stuff, the deep dive stuff I needed to do into it. Um, so yeah, the US debanking is a big issue there. Um, as a percentage, I think here it's bigger. Um, you have databases in Australia. You have systems in place in South Africa, and New Zealand is in a position to do it. Um, outside of that, it's fascinating because this all boils down to data sharing and GDPR, um, and having the ability to share data cross border. Okay, that's how these systems all operate, and the more that organizations um, have sort of parallel systems in place that are adequate to each other, they call it data adequacy,
Right.
then the more you're going to see this. Okay. Um, and I know that CIFAS in particular has got interest and work going on in South Africa and in Australia. So it's creeping out there. And I know that a lot of countries are looking at the systems we've got in the UK and trying to take those on board because we were the first country in the world to develop and really use faster banking systems, which create risk.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So there's all sorts of work going on all over the world to try to, not replicate, but borrow ideas. So I mean, that's again, I go into that in the book. There's to sit here and trying to explain it in half an hour,
Yeah, of course, of
it
course.
was 20 months worth of original thought gone into this.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
yeah.
You mentioned Moyara. I can see Moyara has her hand up. Please
Oh,
correct
great.
me if I've mispronounced your first name, please, Moyara. I noticed Moyara is a professor of financial crime and threat intelligence at the USA, sorry, in the USA. Please do tell us a bit about yourself and your background, Moyara, and then please do take us to the point that you want to make. Thank you.
Sure, sure. So I've been in this field for 3 decades now
Well,
and founded the Financial Crime Intelligence Program at the Middlebury Institute. I do a lot of consulting on the side, mostly for the federal government, a lot of the three-letter agencies. But today what I'm saying, and I also have had experience working in the banking sector, but what I say today are just my own personal reflections. You're all aware of the huge fines that the regulators in the US impose on banks, right? And so the financial institutions are caught between a rock and the hard place. On the one hand, they feel very frustrated about the time and expense that they have to put into their compliance obligations. But I guess the real frustration is that they cannot necessarily act in a way that they think will have the most impact in terms of fighting crime. Instead, the regulators who examine them every several months have a list. It's a check the box list, and they get penalized if they have too many high risk clients. So they will have policies, for example, and again, every bank is different, and cryptocurrency exchanges are different yet again. But typically, some banks, if 3 SARs are written on a customer, at that point, the decision becomes we have to debank them. And for some banks, it's 2 SARs.
Wow.
And they're thinking in terms of cost benefit. Okay. It costs money and time to monitor that account, to file those SARs with FinCEN. And so it's that is the decision logic that is happening when they are making those debanking decisions. It's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate. And sometimes some of these customers are legitimately bad actors,
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
and they are then moving to smaller banks that do not have the compliance capacity and investigative capacity to monitor those accounts and file
Yeah.
all those SARs. So I just
Yeah.
wanted to give that perspective of what's happening here. There
It's
was another point I
yeah.
wanted to
Oh,
make
go
too,
on.
but I
Yeah.
can't think of it right now. But go
No,
ahead, Jeremy.
let me respond. I mean, it's quite that's fascinating. In the UK, if you are marked one of these databases, then basically any bank that is a member of the database is not going to touch you, and you only have to have
Mhm.
one.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. We don't have that in the
No,
US.
there is no leeway. You have one of these, you're out, and
Mm-hmm.
then you're going into the fintechs,
Mm-hmm.
which, as you rightly say, have less protection. But get this, the fintechs want to be regulated, so they end up joining CIFAS. So gradually, you're left with really few options among payment service providers.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on your circumstances, there are 4 or 5 banks that will offer basic banking services to customers, but it depends on what that customer has done as to whether or not they're prepared to take the risk to onboard them.
Yeah.
So,
Go
so
ahead.
we are actually seeing here people who have been completely unbanked.
Yeah.
Okay, who there's more than 1 million people in the UK without a bank account. Now, some of them actually want that. You know, some of them don't trust the banks and don't want a bank account. Fair enough. But you know, we're moving into times where, you know, we're moving into a cashless based society. Everybody to get a job in the UK, you've got various rules and regulations surrounding um, oh, I forget the term. But anyway, you've got to have a bank account, a recognised bank account, to get a job in the UK. And so people are coming to me. They can't get a job because they haven't got a bank account. They can't rent anywhere to live because they haven't got a bank account. The get this, the rent deposit schemes and the credit checks that the estate agents use, they're all members of CIFAS, so they spot them, won't touch them. They can't pay for car insurance on credit. They can't get a mobile phone contract. You know, and suddenly you're left with people who have got actually nowhere to turn. Okay,
Yeah.
other than, well, sod this for a game of soldiers, I'm going to become a criminal.
Yeah.
Allow me
You
to
know.
put this. Allow me to put this point to you both, if I may. It occurs to me that if a bank incorrectly classifies somebody as being the kind of person that ought to be debanked,
Yeah.
the consequences of that debanking will be horrendous. You just gave us
Yes.
a list of consequences which are very, very real. And I'm repeating myself, I know, but I've had conversations with people whose lives are being completely ruined because a bank has debanked them with no explanation and no justification. There's one guy I'm thinking about whose wife has ended up having all kinds of PST, post-traumatic stress disorder type consequences because the family business has had to be closed down. An intergenerational business. Can you imagine it? Anyway, the damage is horrific. Now, the bank's action caused these people problems. The bank's action has effectively tarnished their reputation in the
Yeah.
capitalist system. They can't go and get another bank account, etc. If somebody had committed slander or did something defamatory where you incorrectly and in an unjustified way critique the reputation of somebody, it's kind of got parallels to that. And you'd have a means in the court through the judicial process to challenge that. You have defamed me, you have slandered me, you have caused me harm, you were wrong in doing so, and I can prove it here. That is effectively a parallel to what we're talking about right now. But it seems like the justice system does absolutely nothing to give these folk a chance to fight back. Well, why
Yeah.
is that? Why is society allowing that to happen?
So what we've now got, and you'll love this, Mara, is there's a reverse burden of proof. The banks only have to have reasonable suspicion in order to debank you and load you to a database. To get that removed, you've got to prove your innocence. Okay. So one of the problems that I get with money mules is that they're typically young. They haven't seen it coming. They're using Snapchat, disappearing messages after 24 hours. How do you prove that you're exploited if you can't prove that you've been exploited? And that's where we are. We're getting genuinely nice people who are genuinely trying to make their way in life and who have got, you know, maybe even doing, I've had loads of accountancy degree students and economics students and, you know, law students, intelligent people who have been, you know, exploited because they haven't seen what's going on and haven't read the signs because they don't know, they haven't got the tools because they've never been given the tools to see what the signs are. And suddenly they are losing the lot. Their career paths are gone. It really is shocking. And a lot of harm could be prevented if people actually understand how to protect themselves.
Your argument is valid. It's if people are educated and understand, are less likely to become victims. I get that. So in the future, the problem could be solved by educating, but we have a here and now situation
I
where there
know.
are people whose lives have been ruined
Yeah.
and nothing and nobody seems to be able to defend them. We've even had situations where the person's MP has written to the bank, please explain what you've done and why. And the bank's basically said, we don't have to explain anything. We've just done it. It's there's a real asymmetry of power and information here that's just not right. Mayara put a hand up. We'll go back to Mayara and then we'll go to Michael Loughnane, who's in the US as well, I think. Mayara, pleased to have your contribution. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So again, this is not an industry-wide policy, but what the larger banks will typically do when they suspect mule account activity is they will send a letter to the owner of that account explaining that they've noticed unusual activity and basically letting them know this has to stop or we may have to close your account.
Wow, we can't do that here. They
Okay.
can't do it because it's an offence called tipping off.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, this does, we have tipping off rules as well, but this does not count as tipping off. And what
Okay.
will typically happen is that the activity will stop. When it doesn't stop, then they may refer it to law enforcement.
Yeah.
And at that point, they do have the option of debanking the individual. You'll have to excuse me, I'm in a public location here. I had a yoga class just before this, so I'm in my club. Yeah, anyway, so this sounds like a situation very unique to the UK.
Yeah, it is.
And it's dreadful what I'm hearing.
Yeah, thank you.
I've just put a note in the chat. That's a hugely valuable piece of information, Moyara. You've just given us a way forward in terms of what needs to happen in terms of policy reform. Our argument is basically in the States, this is how they deal with tripping off situations. It creates an opportunity for the innocent victim to argue why they shouldn't be dealt with in this way. We don't have that in the UK. It's causing carnage in the UK that's not happening in the US. Let's bring the US policy in line with the States. That's a fantastically valuable piece of information, Mayara.
Indeed.
I think Jeremy's agreeing with that. Let's bring Michael Loughnane into the conversation. Also, we've got film director Jim Sheridan with us tonight. If Jim's sort of within earshot, please do chip into the conversation, Jim. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and we know that you are a man with a very, very strong sense of social justice and have an ability to bring things to life through documentaries and films in an unrivaled way, as far as I'm concerned. I'm a big fan, big fan, Jim. But let's go to Michael first of all. Michael, what would you like to tell us about your thoughts and your perspective on all this stuff? Thank you.
First, I thank you for the opportunity. And by the way, just as a quick side note, I want to congratulate you folks for doing a great presentation at the ACAN webinar yesterday, talking about your organization. It was well done.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
And number two, there's only so many places on this planet you can have a conversation and say, yeah, I'm in fraud, and not have something shoot back at you. So that was fine. And also the third point I've learned so far is because you started 6 p.m. your time, I have to acclimate to your time. Therefore, next time I will have my whiskey ready at my table instead of water. So I've learned 3 things already. More seriously, my own background, I have a varied background, but let me just say I became an investigator specializing in fraud in 1981. So I've had quite a run at this for a while. And for the last 15 years, I have been an instructor in dealing with terror finance investigation with financial elements of those entities funding terror organizations, as well as doing a focus since 2016 in training the boots on the ground, state, local, and federal investigators in the conduct of financial crime. investigations. Sorry, I should probably add that at the end. But in doing the investigations, and here's the reality, and therefore I've had a whole lot of interaction with the financial institutions and to support what Mayara. By the way, I love your name. I hope I'm saying it right, Mayara. It's fantastic. I love it.
It's
I'm sorry.
You were
Moya.
it's pronounced correctly pronounced Moyada. It's
Moyada.
Brazilian mother, Danish, German father, but
I love it.
just call me Mo. Everybody else does.
I had a sister named Mo, so yeah, I got you there. I have a whole lot of little notes here I'd love to discuss, but let me just focus to the point that I want to do it. Since I started as a fraud investigator, all the way up to when I retired from the government and got into my second career, fraud has always been the second chair to a lot of other types of crime because they don't have the same visibility, and therefore you didn't have the same aptitude. I would bring cases to refer to the United States Attorney's Office for federal prosecution. And just as a quick side story, I'd be sitting there next to an FBI agent who maybe had a bank robbery, a DEA agent that had a narcotics bust, where they go in, make the presentation, quick grand jury, case gets heard, move on to the next case. I'm walking in with a case that could take 2 to 3 years of grand jury time to conduct. So there's a natural hesitancy to get an effective fraud case put into place. But that was the one thing I will take credit for in my career. I was able to do that quite well, and I was very happy with that. But what you came down to, and I want to speak specifically to the construct of the banking element. Okay, here is the real problem. Two big problems. The first problem is we have put the detection mechanisms in the hands of those who don't want to see them. Okay, the Customer Identification Program, the Bank Secrecy Act in 1970, and everything that happened since then has been given to entities, banks, that are trying to make a profit, are trying to grow their business, are trying to make other types of decisions, and we are putting in front of them these mechanisms that actually hinder their business process. Now, that will vary, and in my training courses, I talk about it as the level of acceptable risk. How much risk is that bank willing to take or financial institution willing to take with a customer in order to gain financial benefit from them? The low-level account holders, low on the list, easy to jettison and debank. The multi-mega millionaires, not so much, because there's a lot of value that comes out of those customers. So it will vary based on who the customer is, and those decisions will be made accordingly. They will also accept, I can go back decades, but cases of where you had banks that made decisions knowing they were involved in criminal cases, in criminal activity, but they weighed the penalty against the profit. And they maintained the thinking, okay, if we get caught, we're still going to only have to pay this much. We still will benefit in profit. So it's a business process, a business mechanism that these institutions have to make. So the training to them, that's why, frankly, I love the videos. I used to see those videos, and Jeremy, they were fantastic, but they were the minimum level of acknowledgement of an issue because they really didn't want to see it. And that's because it interfered with their profitability. And if they get caught, cost of doing business.
Yeah.
So that's the mechanism we're dealing with when we deal with trying to get the banks to be responsive. And one more point on that, and then I'll shut up, is that law enforcement generally, I can't speak to the UK, I can speak to the US. We are not the first ones to see the activity. This is where suspicious transaction reporting or suspicious activity reporting becomes such a critical tool and it needs to be played. And that is a critical element that must be put in place relative to that we have to. The problem is once law enforcement detects it, and there's so many SARs that come in, that to find one to initiate alone is rare.
Mike, you're causing me to share my screen. I'll tell you why. Allow me to cut in there if I may, just for a moment. Back in 2022, 6th of September 2022, we had a talk by a guy called Chris Blackhurst, who's a very well-respected
That's a great
journalist,
example. Yeah, that's a great case.
journalist over here. Yeah. And he told us basically, HSBC Bank in America was so commercially minded, so motivated to make money, so desperate for profit, etc., that it basically turned a blind eye to literally, a suitcase of cash coming in from Mexican drug cartels. Okay, and the bank knew it was happening, but the point you're making is so valid. The bank was motivated to not cause a problem over the money because it wanted the money. And you're making me think of, and I promise I will shut up in a minute, Mike. You're making me think of that famous quote by Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's right-hand man. The quote is, "Show me the incentive, and I'll show you the outcome."
Yeah,
Which-
exactly.
Which
Yeah,
speaks to the
spot on.
idea that if the bank is incentivized to turn a blind eye, that's what it will do. So your point is hyper valid. If the people who are the front line have an interest in keeping their eyes shut and their ears closed, then they're not going to say anything. It's the system's crazy. Mike, what do you say to that?
I'd say that's exactly correct. I think I heard a Chinese saying, Noises Maim used it in a video deck on illicit trade years ago. Chinese saying to say you kill chickens to scare the monkey. So you're going to take out the low hanging actors in banking, the mules. You want to use them as an example. Get rid of them because you're demonstrating you're using a proper and appropriate customer identification program in order to deal with these challenges. But you're not going after the main players.
Yeah.
One more point, and then I will shut up, sir, is the real challenge is, and I think I mentioned this in the last presentation, which I'm thank you again for the opportunity to speak here, is that the law enforcement mechanism is not designed to effectively deal with this problem in the United States or anywhere. When you think about, I was specifically trained for fraud investigations. There's not that many people, given the number of crimes that have occurred over the time of immemorial, the number of people who are specifically trained to understand and put together criminal cases in fraud is much smaller than someone that makes a drug deal. Because of the resource element that's attached to that, putting in the effort, the training, the maintenance, it is a tough place to maintain. Faster turnaround, better money, smaller crimes. And that, I think, is where we are actually facing today. So am I hopeful that you're going to see more effective fraud investigations in the future? I wish I were more. I'm not.
No, I agree with you.
I think we can look at, the faster law enforcement can turn around and say, hey, we're effective. We stopped this. We stopped this. We stopped that. But the fraud guys, no. And in my cases, last point, in my cases, when we came across the guy who handled the money, that was the guy we turned. We rolled him over, cut a deal with him to get back into the rest of the network. And therefore, the risk impact to someone in that profession is minimized, and they know it, and they know it. So I have a lot more, but I'll shut up there. By the way, database, question back to you all. You say that you understand that deregulation is happening in the United States. Yes. Other than the beneficial ownership, of which I am livid over, right? What other deregulations? Did I miss something?
Oh, yeah, you've missed a lot then. So we know an organization called Better Markets in the States, and they produce a wonderful database. I'm sharing my screen here, Mike, called Trump Tracker. By the way, TTF is not politically aligned at all. We have no interest in politics per se, but this Better Markets database is merely a factual account of activity. I'll read out a bit for you here, Mike.
Okay.
The Trump administration is making historic changes to financial policy and our regulatory system. Our team is tracking these changes by agency below. For me personally, probably the worst thing that's happened in the States in the last 6 months or so, as far as this topic is concerned, is effectively the defanging of the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Mm,
I see Mayara is nodding at that. It's
yeah,
nuts,
I
you know,
agree with that.
because the CFPB was created in response to the global financial crisis. It was the USA's response to people have been harmed by the financial sector. Let's represent their interests. And
Mm,
the CFPB was put in place to do that. The Canadians have got something similar called Fair Canada. The Europeans have got something called Better Finance. So when the current American administration basically sacked the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and put somebody else in with a much lightweight agenda, it was a signal, a real strong signal that the current administration is concerned about all this stuff. I'll put a link in this to the chat, folks, because there's
Okay.
so much data here. What's a real worry for us Brits, you know, is
Wow.
there's a similar tension between the deregulatory activity going on in the States and the deregulatory activity happening in the UK. And here's the irony of all ironies. Here we go. I'm getting on my soapbox now. Okay.
All right. Before you do that, though, I will say from my position on that, Andy, was because from an investigation perspective,
Yeah.
I teach and train to the tools that a law enforcement officer would use in a case.
Yeah.
Mm,
I've not seen any changes or adjustments to those particular tools. The CFPB is a whole nother animal and issue, and frankly, more on the political side.
Yeah.
The tools that are based out of FinCEN, other than budget and argument and resource, I've not seen any changes relative to the quality of that information. So that's, I guess, that's where I was coming from.
I get
okay.
it. It'll be
Get
interesting
that.
area to watch. I'll invite Jeremy to come back in a moment, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. But the irony I was going to make, or so the point I was going to make, sorry, was that the global financial crisis happened caused by banking misconduct in very, very simplistic terms. That led to regulatory developments. Now, as a consequence of the global financial crisis, certainly in the UK, our GDP growth has flatlined ever since. And now we've got a government that is hell bent on stimulating growth through deregulating. And as a consequence, is we are worried, starting to implement policies that will deregulate, that will remove consumer protections, that will expose society to more risk. And we've almost completely lost the lessons learned from the global financial crisis. I'll leave that one hanging. Let's go back to Jeremy for any further thoughts, and then we'll open up to anybody else that wants to chip into the conversation. Jeremy, thank you.
Yeah, going very quickly, going back to Michael's points. Yeah, I get it. In the States, it's all about business. In the UK, the government has regulated the banks and placed the banks into this mix of counter fraud, and they have got regulatory duties as a result of that. And those were ramped up recently in the Data Uses and Users Act 2025. So basically, the whole debanking thing is now regarded as a recognized legitimate interest. The banks have a recognized legitimate interest to act in the way the government is telling it to do so, but there are certain caveats to that. So it's slightly different, I think. This is state-led, what's going on in the UK, and the banks are forced down this road. But the trouble is, it's the banks that are making the decisions, and the regulators are then your appeal mechanism, because you can't go to court until you've exhausted arbitration. So that means CIFAS or the Financial Ombudsman Service will take it. But that's basically it. And so you've got protected interests. I mean, CIFAS is a protected interest. It is a business that makes its money out of the banks by providing this database service for National Fraud Database. There's no recall against the other databases. Synetics Solutions and National Hunter don't have appeal processes. So basically, the customer is between a rock and a hard place. If they are debanked, you've got to really understand what you're doing to A, understand whether or not it's been loaded correctly, and then B, to then prove that your appeal is justifiable. So that's where there's a big difference between UK and the States, and in that sense, from what we've learned tonight and from my reading and understanding of it, it's much more draconian in the UK, much more.
It certainly seems that way. My big takeaway from tonight is to compare contrast the UK and the US way of handling tipping off in this context.
Yeah,
That's really interesting to me. Folks,
it was.
let's open it up for anybody that wants to chip into the conversation. I see we've got Nigel Cairns here, we've got Mark Bannister here, we've got Stuart Cotton, Wayne, John Cock, Seamus May. Any of you, or indeed anybody else, Mike Grimsdale. Mike, you would have seen, I'm sure, Mike Grimsdale, the note that Seamus May made about banks in Europe, in Germany, being a lot more kind of old school. I know that's a sentiment that you, Mike, would agree with. Mike's, if I can put it this way, very much an old school former bank manager. Wayne, you've raised your hand. Please do chip in, Wayne. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sir Andy. Yeah, hi all. Another great session. So much interesting information. Now, Mike and Mo, I've sent you some details of my case. I know it's only very small compared to some of the things that Andy's dealing with, but it is Americans, about Bank of America. Insider fraud, a couple of years, they had no idea. They've completely run away from it. I was just interested to hear your views on what happens in America. I'm just completely whacked out by the whole thing. The ethics, as Andy said, like the ethics, the morals, the professionalism. But yeah, I'd like you just to have a look at that at some time, and I'd love to catch up with you at some point. But no, it's great to have you on. I know, Mo, you're in California. I think Mike, you're on the other side of the country, aren't you?
Outside of DC. Well, Manassas, Virginia.
There you go. Yeah. So, but no, great to have you on, Andy. Great talk, and yeah, really, really good.
Thank you, Wayne. I made a note in the chat, Wayne. Please do, if you can, populate the chat with links to the documentaries about your
Okay.
case. I think not only Mike and Mo and Jeremy would find them interesting, others would too. And we are talking about a major banking institution in the US. It's a fascinating case. Thank you, Wayne, for chipping in.
Yeah. No, but one thing just before I go, Andy.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a couple of documentaries on TV which have aired in America too, so I will put those
Right.
links in. Yeah, thanks, Andy.
Good on you. Good on you. Mr. Nigel Cairns in Devon. Nigel, what would you like to share with us? Thank you.
Yeah, just want to ask Jeremy, to what degree does he think that young people, or any people for that matter, should be educated in examining the risks in trusting their banks that they're pretty much compelled to deal with?
It's a good question. Yeah. Look, I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, from my point of view, the older, more established banks are generally safer, generally speaking. I think I talk about this in the way that I see certain banks are very trigger happy. So I mentioned in my talk about the difference of 6%, between 6% and 66% of banks loading to the National Fraud Database. Some banks are trigger happy and are therefore a greater risk for young people because they are more likely, statistically, to find themselves being marked with a CIFAS marker than other banks. Now, you know, that I think is a fair comment, particularly if you've got somebody who's got a real career path ahead of them and, you know, is going into
I'm
accountancy,
thinking,
finance,
sorry if
commerce.
I can interrupt there. I'm thinking along the lines of people that have been involved in IRHP and other scandals like that weren't sophisticated necessarily.
Mm.
And there are plenty of them that have lost certainly life-changing sums of money.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I get that.
And
I think due diligence goes both ways, and at the end of the day, a lot of people are swayed by fancy marketing and fancy notions of having pockets in their apps and all online and all that sort of thing. But as you get older, you actually want to be able to pop along to the bank and have a chat with somebody sometimes. And so the fintechs actually, as you get more sophisticated and become older, aren't so good. But I totally get what you're saying. But are there any banks that aren't untainted?
If I may, I'm going to bring Nigel's point to life a little bit more by sharing something with you that I wasn't expecting to mention tonight, but let me do it anyway. So this is a play I went to see in Scotland. It's a play about the collapse of RBS. I'll just read a bit out here, okay? Brian Cox stars in the biting satire on the Scottish banking ambition that shattered the global economy. Behold the rise and fall and fail of the biggest bank in the world, RBS. At the helm is Fred the Shred Goodwin, armed with an unshakable belief in the wisdom of the founder of modern capitalism, Adam Smith. The once prudent RBS soars and then plummets, placing Scotland at the heart of the global financial crash of 2008. I am desperately hoping that they make this play available around the country because it was absolutely fantastic. And the reason I mention it in the context of what Nigel asked is because there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the global financial crisis led banking to be able to get away with all kinds of nefarious activities for several years in an attempt to shore up their balance sheets. The government and the regulators looked the other way. And in the meantime, people like interest rate hedging product victims, the folks that Nigel was speaking up for just now, were absolutely harmed. I nearly used a bad word. Were absolutely harmed by their banks. Thank you, Nigel, for making that point. Mr. Stuart Cotton, very nice to meet you early today. I know I'm repeating myself. I made that point in the chat. What would you like to add, Stuart? And then we'll go to any others for final comment, then we'll wrap up. Stuart Cotton, thank you.
Yeah, it's just a bit of a question, really. I am a complex financial investigator and a whistleblower, and I know all the rules about what not to do and what to do with your bank account. And despite that, I've been debanked on 6 different occasions. And just wondering, the question being, is this a breach of my human rights? I would have thought Article 6, the right to a fair trial, Article 8, right to private and family life.
Wow.
As a newcomer, are these on the horizon?
Okay, very quickly, it's not Article 6. It's not. There is no right to a fair trial. Book explains the reasons for that.
Yeah.
It is Article 8. But of course, we're in a position where Article 8 is becoming less relevant to UK politics, and that presents an area of concern. Yeah.
So just as a fraud investigator, it hurts quite a lot to be accused of fraud.
I can imagine. Yeah. I mean, if you want to email me, and we can have a look at it. We'd be happy to have a chat.
I just found a bit of blurb online about Article 8 for those that want to know. Thank you, Stuart. Stuart, if you pop me an email asking me to introduce you to Jeremy, obviously I'll be very happy to do that. Lindsay Rogerson, I hope you're not driving still. Lindsay, please do chip into the conversation. Thank you.
No, I'm not driving, and I've moved to the ground floor of my house, so hopefully the Wi-Fi will hold up. Thank you, Jeremy. It's been really fascinating hearing you speak. I'm just curious, and I haven't had the benefit of reading your book as yet. I'm just wondering, what solutions do you put forward for how to tackle this? Obviously, I'm not wishing you to give away everything that's in the book. I'm just wondering, like, is there a top 3 of, what is the fix here that you see after looking into this?
The solution, and Andy's going to love this, is greater transparency.
Hooray!
It really is, because
But what forces,
think-
sorry, what forces that, Jeremy? How do you bring that about?
so you bring that about by educating people about how banking works and how fraud works and how fraudsters work, so that you can run for the hills. You can spot the signs and you can make sure you're not going to get exploited.
Okay, sorry. What I was meaning was you had some criticism of the databases. I'm sorry to hide. I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to understand a bit more. So you had some criticism of the databases. So is there a fix in terms of the databases that would help people who find themselves debanked, basically because they've been the victim of fraud or they've been a mule, inadvertently?
So unfortunately, we've got this new legislation that makes it actually tougher to get yourself off one of these databases.
Wow.
Okay. The book talks about the notion of fairness. I think that still applies. Actually, I think the banks can override, and I think the banks can treat people with fairness and dignity if they choose to. I don't think the law has changed that, but that is not the message the banks are being told by the government, and the banks don't understand the law a lot of the time. I've literally had to explain how fraud databases work to organizations that loaded markers when I've actually asked them to remove. They don't understand what their powers are. There's ignorance in the system and there's ignorance about the system.
Hence you taking the conversation to education. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. Mark Bannister, then we'll probably bring tonight's conversation to a close. Mr. Bannister, you've become quite traditional, a final commenter at these events. What are you going to say for us tonight, Mark?
So I want to hear what everybody else has got to say so I can sound vaguely intelligent at the end. Thank you for everybody's contributions. It's a fascinating subject. It seems to me that we've got a huge number of problems, but most fundamentally of all is that people don't seem today, especially people in power who have the opportunity to make this legislation and enact it, oversee it, enforce it, etc. They're not honest themselves. Now, I do have a problem, Jeremy, with your solution around education. Yes, it is right, but practically no, it's not going to happen. Because the reality of this is that for all of us to protect ourselves against every piece of legislation, whether it's driving your car, walking down the street, avoiding being debanked, your level of knowledge has got to be superhuman. Now, fortunately, we've got AI coming to help us, but the problem with that is it's after the event. So I think it's an excellent idea, but to understand banking, I would argue you've got to understand that there is no money. Now, I don't want to divert everybody into that whole rabbit hole, but when most people have no concept about what money is and all the rest of it, how the hell do you expect them to understand how their bank account operates?
Yeah.
It just goes on and on from there. But what we've fundamentally got to also recognize is that our legislators are perpetrators of this biggest set of crimes. They are not interested in solving these problems because they are the ones, that's how they operate power. That's where their power come from. And the moment you start tearing those problems down, then you end their hegemony. And that is not about to happen. So we have to, I'm afraid, have a rather more fundamental reset than believing that we can tinker around at the margins, because I just, don't see it. My other comment to you is the most powerful solution in my experience is incentive. If we had a circumstance where everybody's taxes were at 10% or whatever the number was, and it paid for you to pay tax because there would be a 10,000% levy if you fail to pay your tax or you do bad things, then it is remarkable how people will take the path of least resistance. But we don't seem to operate that. So guess what? It pays to be malevolent. So what do you get? More malevolence. And with that rather big picture, sad thought, I'll hand over to Seamus, who's got his hand up.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. We'll go to Seamus. Seamus May, please do chip in.
Listen, just a little point that it might assist all these experts on the debanking. I hadn't really come up with this. I wasn't familiar with the term debanking as such, but in 1994, the European Commission made a decision against the European cement cartel. And they found that the cartel had many different weapons to evict competitors or to prevent people barriers to entry. But one of them was seeking the assistance of international banks to convince the producers destabilizing the market, intermediaries and ship owners to cooperate. And in my family's case, we were basically just blacklisted by every single bank in Ireland. And the defendants, the cement giants, had directors on virtually all of these banks. And that remains the case for the last 35 years. We're completely and totally blacklisted. So it's not that they closed their account because they knew we weren't doing anything fishy, but they closed their credit and called in loans. I presume that's just another way that the banking can be used sort of in an anti-competitive manner. Would anyone agree or have come across the likes of that before?
Wow.
No, I hadn't come across that one.
So what you're describing there, Seamus, is almost retaliation by the banking system to cause you harm for being in the circumstance you were in.
If I can contribute, it's absolutely what goes on all day long. If you have a rich and powerful competitor, they will use every tool at their disposal, and that most of all, the 101 of that is your financial relationships. And I remember my days at a very large investment bank, which I won't mention the name of because it's inappropriate, but the answer is you all know it. It's probably number 1 or 2 in the world. And that happened all day long because we were incentivized to go where the money was.
Fascinating stuff, Seamus.
We did it all day, every day.
I made reference to Munger's quote, Mark, when he spoke a moment ago, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. If we believe in that line of thought, then what we effectively need then is a system where the incentives to commit fraud are removed, the incentives to investigate and chase down fraud are maximized, the incentives for the regulators to catch the baddies and start to leverage the power of deterrent is harnessed. That's what we need. We need an incentives-driven model.
Sorry, I'm going to make one further contribution. You've heard me say this before.
Yeah.
Health and safety. There used to be horrendous accidents on building sites, etc., etc. And then in came the health and safety, and they made it responsible so that the managing directors and the board of directors of all of these companies were in terrible state and would go straight to jail if somebody fell off, an accident happened on site. But instead of people dying every day, it's a rarity now because the directors get locked up, and it happens. And it only has to happen marginally once or twice for everybody on board to sign up to it. And they all do now. The other situation is flying. We don't have commercial aeroplanes dropping out of the sky, thank God, because everybody has to be accountable. And, if you change a nut and a bolt on an aeroplane, you, as the engineer who does that, you sign for it. Your name is on it, and your supervisor, and so on, all the way up the chain. So that if some terrible circumstance happens, right? Everybody in that line of accountability is held to account, and everybody knows that that is there and that is in place. And so thankfully, it's a very considerable rarity today. But while we don't have that legislation or those circumstances in the financial industry, are we surprised that everybody's going to do what they do? Answer, more fool you if you are.
Mark, thank you very much. Great input. We'll go to Jeremy for his final words in just a moment. I've just written down the phrase accountability cures in the chat, Mark, because I think you're absolutely spot on there. Accountability cures. People behave according to what their own it's fundamentally Adam Smith, isn't it? People will behave according to what's in their best interests. And if it suits them to have a sense of enlightened self-interest, that's how they'll behave. If they're accountable, they'll behave as though they are accountable. If they're not accountable, they'll behave as though they're not accountable. That is why the system's failing so much. There's a lack of accountability, a lack of transparency, a lack of scrutiny. All these problems we've discussed tonight, every one of them is solvable. We just need different policies and procedures in place.
And
Thank
Andy,
you, Mark.
a lack of consequence.
Lack of
Accountability with consequence.
Lock them up is Mark Bannister's message, quite rightly so. Jeremy, you've really stimulated a great conversation tonight, talking about yourself, your background, your book. You have the final words, sir, before I formally wrap the conversation up. What would you like to end the conversation with? Thank you.
If you haven't done so already, please go out and buy it. It's available online as an ebook. You know, you don't have to get a hard copy. And look, it's not that thick, okay? But yeah, I've tried to make it readable, and I hope you enjoy it and get a lot out of it.
Fantastic stuff. Fantastic stuff. Can we please show our appreciation to Jeremy and everybody who's contributed to a very, very pleasant and very constructive conversation. Thank you all very, very much. Alexandra, could you please remind me to do something about compare contrast US versus UK in relation to tip-off relationships, and we'll liaise with Jeremy and Moyara about that as well. Thank you all very much indeed. Good night. Good night. Good night. Cheers, Jeremy. That was great.
You
Thank
take care. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Andy.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Good night
you.
all. Good night all. Thank you.